The closing topic on macroeconomics is supply side policies. And we've saved the best for the last here because supply side policies are really the policies that are going to make the biggest difference economically. They're also the things that are politically hardest to pull off because a lot of people don't understand how economics works. So let's just go back and just to understand how the big picture here. When we're talking about supply side policies, what we're talking about is just policies that will move long range aggregate supply to the right. And what does that give you? It gives you more stuff at a lower price throughout the economy. I mean, if we go way back to the three basic economic questions: what to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce, that sort of assumes you're stuck with a certain capacity in your society. But the bigger question in these three is how can we get more for everybody? How can we make things less scarce? How can we have more of everything so that we don't have to choose as much what to produce? An abundance of goods for everybody. Another way to look at it, if you go way back to the beginning, is this production possibility curve. It's how do you make this curve move out and create the possibility of it being able to produce more goods? So the big picture, the big idea about supply side policies is, yeah, you can do monetary policy and you can do it quickly and you can have an impact on the economy. You can even spend a bunch of money or reduce taxes and free up money and target it on different parts of the economy and have an impact. But ultimately, unless you fix the supply side, make things cheaper and easier to produce, you're not going to get to the heart of really getting more for everybody. Uh, and so we're going to go through different supply side policies, different things that governments can do. And the problem is many governments that are struggling don't do them for reasons, many reasons, and we'll get into those. So in modern economics, the basic assumption of economists is that governments uh, need to help markets work. When governments try to do the work of markets, you go to the extreme of that and you have what happened, or is still kind of happening in communist Cuba, but communist countries. Governments aren't very good at allocating scarce resources. So, what governments are good at is creating a competitive market playing field for companies where market forces uh, create the best allocation for people. But when we're talking about governments getting involved, basically we're talking about laws, legislation, and then regulation that enacts laws. And the question is, what kind of laws can be passed? And so the first area is laws that increase the productive capacity. So anything that increases labor, remember one of the big factors of production, is going to help increase productive capacity. That includes immigration. You may know that immigration tends to be very unpopular in most countries. Yet, economically, it is a wonderful thing. It helps the economy grow. So, the question economists have is how do you manage that in a politically viable way? You can help the economy grow by lowering working age or raising retirement age, basically getting more people into the labor force, and also by providing more opportunities for individuals in the labor force. The second thing governments can do is capital, another factor of production. So lowering interest rates makes capital more accessible. Giving tax breaks also makes taxing more accessible. And they don't mention it here, but probably one of the biggest things that governments do is they provide a court system. And the courts allow fair playing. So when someone makes a capital investment, or they're willing to make a capital investment because they know they're going to be treated fairly and it's not going to be taken away from them by the government or by other people. In addition to the factors of production we just talked about, governments get involved in trying to make markets more efficient, and this airline industry is a good one where 30 years ago, each country had their own national airline and prices were expensive, flights were difficult to get on, and most governments sold their national airline to the free market, but created policies to make it competitive so that all these airlines had access to, for example, the gates at airports so they could supply. And that kind of activity can be politically very difficult because there's going to be losers and winners, but yet creating an even playing field and letting competition flourish is a major role for competition and a major difficulty for competition. And this graph, again, it's worth saying, all we're talking supply side policies is moving the long range aggregate supply to the right and allowing more stuff, Y2, at a lower price so that more people, there's less scarcity. Another great example of what governments can do and why they often fail is labor flexibility. A lot of governments say, hey, we got to protect these workers. We got to pass laws that you can't fire people, you can't lay them off, you have to protect them. Well, those laws sound great and they're very popular, except they make the labor force very inflexible. And when a company that the market is saying you're failing, can't lay off their workers, they end up producing less efficiently. So the big idea here is that uh, the government has to be willing to allow creative destruction. Let companies that aren't producing what the market wants fail, and allow them to lay off those workers, and then help those workers, retrain them, and allow them to move to new locations so they can uh, flexibly move where they're needed. Again, the laws to do this could be tremendously unpopular. We talked a little bit about Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. Um, that you know, when they went in and reduced the power of trade unions represent many voters. You try to reduce or remove minimum wages. Again, you have people going, that's horrible. The government's not doing what I want them to do. So a lot of these concepts don't make a lot of sense to people until they've studied economics. That actually it's pain in the short run that's worth it for a big gain in the long run. Here's another example: reducing welfare. I mean, that just sounds horrible, right? But if you make welfare so comfy that people don't really feel like they need to work, then you've really created a difficult situation for employment. This next section we'll talk a lot more about when we get into international, how inflation impacts your currency rates. Uh, but another great one to talk about, it's funny how it's worded here, increasing firms' incentives to invest in innovation. I mean, typically what happens is governments jump in and do all kinds of things that cause companies not to want to invest in innovation, like tax investments in capital and capital gains, so that companies don't want to make those investments. And this is really saying companies need to get rid of those, countries need to get rid of those kind of laws and make it advantageous for companies to invest in innovation that will reduce cost. The rest of these sections go into more detail with supply side policies, starting out with the policies to increase competition. If you go back, and again, this is like a summary of the course, right? If you go back and remember the monopoly versus monopolistic markets, right? The idea here is for countries to create rules so that you can't have monopolies and the markets act more like monopolistic competition. Why? Because lower prices at a bigger quantity. That's good. That's the supply side thing that moves the aggregate supply out when it happens across many industries. And ultimately, although very few perfectly competitive markets exist, let's go back and review perfect competition. Again, in perfect competition, you're moving the supply side to the right for the market, and you get a lower price and a higher quantity. Now, for the firm, that's a little bit ugly because they're moving from a higher quantity, a higher price to a lower quantity, more firms at a lower quantity. So again, there's a lot of politics where firms will say, "No, this is horrible. You're hurting me. You're hurting my employees," and it's difficult. You have to have really strong, good government and politicians to make this supply side topic happen. That is to try to make markets more competitive. That's 3.7.2. 3.7.3, again, is a politically very difficult thing because oftentimes to make the market for labor more competitive, you're making laborers, you're causing short term dislocation for laborers when they're laid off, when their wages go down. So, again, very difficult politically, but in the long run, very good for the economy. It makes the aggregate supply move to the right and more goods available at a lower price for the economy.